Hey everyone, suddenly Tim Walz wants to turn down the temperature. Hey everyone, I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and that was Governor Tim Walz taking a different tone with regard to ICE and the protests against it in his state, clearly reacting to a threat from President Trump to invoke the Insurrection Act in Minnesota. What I want to explain in this video is why there is no question the Insurrection Act applies to current conditions in Minneapolis. I'm going to do this three parts. One, we're going to talk a little about the history of the act. Two, we'll look specifically at the language of the act. And three, I'll make some humble suggestions to the progressive leadership in Minneapolis and Minnesota, how they can help avoid this coming about. But the big point here is that Donald Trump would be fully within his rights right now at this moment, based on current conditions in Minneapolis, to send the active duty military there. Now, I'd like to give credit to the research material I use in these videos to the extent I can. So I just want to mention I'm going to heavily rely, not entirely, but a lot, on a great article published by the National Defense University Press on the Insurrection Act. Now, as the authors of this article point out, the basic story here for a long time is ever escalating discretion and authority for the president to call out troops to deal with unrest. But at the time of the founding, there's a tension, right? Because founders hate the idea of the army being used for domestic purposes, but they also fear unrest. And a key influence on the creation of the Constitution is under the Articles of Confederation, you get so-called Shays Rebellion in Western Massachusetts, freaks everyone out. They want a government that is strong enough to deal with these kind of threats. So that helps form the Constitution. But then very quickly, Congress goes further. In 1792, it passes a Militia Act delegating authority to call out the militia to the president. Now, this is conditioned. You need an official, a judge, or a member of the judiciary to certify that laws are no longer enforceable in a given area if the president's going to call out the troops. There's a time limit. You can only do this for 30 days when Congress is in session. And the president needs to notify the forces of disorder, hey, I'm coming for you unless you stop. And sure enough, George Washington, he meets all these criteria, but uses this power to deal with the Whiskey Rebellion quite successfully. Then in 1795, Congress passes another Militia Act removing those various checks on the president. And then 1807, Congress goes further and allows the president not just to call on state militias, but to call directly on federal forces. And this 1807 measure has the support of none other than Thomas Jefferson. In the 19th century, you had the Supreme Court taking up various cases, vindicating the president's power in this area. Then you had the Civil War. Lincoln initially relies on the Militia Acts to call up troops to respond to Southern secession. 1861, Congress expands the president's power in this area. 1871, Reconstruction era, Congress expands the president's power in this area and adds a proviso saying that when citizens' rights are being violated, the president can send in troops. Now, you do get later in the 19th century, the Posse Comitatus Act meant to limit the use of federal troops for law enforcement purposes. By the way, by this point, you probably noticed there wasn't one Insurrection Act. There are a lot of overlapping militia acts. So it could be a little confusing in that respect. But what basically happens, again, to simplify, in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes sends federal troops to deal with the Great Railroad Strike, and that really unleashes the floodgates in terms of using troops to deal with domestic unrest. 1894, you get the Pullman Strike. President Grover Cleveland sends in the troops. The socialist organizer and unionist Eugene Debs objects, says, no, we can't do that. Case goes to the Supreme Court, and Debs gets stuffed. The court said, quote, the strong arm of the federal government may be put forth to brush away all obstructions to the freedom of interstate commerce or to the transportation of the mails. That was at issue in the strike. If the emergency arises, the army of the nation and all its militia are at the service of the nation to compel obedience to its laws. The court acknowledged there are limits to the domestic use of the military, but, quote, insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combinations, or conspiracies, end quote, provide the president essentially unfettered authority, as this article puts it, to respond in preservation of the law. The military ends up being frequently used to put down unrest. Check this out. In 1903, TR sends in forces to deal with labor disputes in Arizona, Colorado, and then a little later in Nevada. 1919, Wilson suppresses race riots in Washington, Omaha, Elaine, Arkansas, Lexington, Kentucky, then also sends in troops to deal with labor unrest in Butte, Montana, Seattle, Gary, Indiana, Knoxville, Tennessee, and Denver. The National Guard and regular Army also involved in West Virginia's mine strike wars in 1920 to 1921. In the middle of the 20th century, you have Eisenhower using federal troops to enforce desegregation. You have JFK using federal troops to respond to a race riot in Mississippi. And then repeatedly, federal troops are used in the 60s to respond to big anti-war protests or to respond to riots in our cities. For the last several decades, the practice has been not to call out federal troops unless it's in the most very extreme sort of situation. Last time it happened, George H.W. Bush calls out active duty military to help deal with the LA riot, which was a totally out of control situation. But the Insurrection Act is still on the books. Let's take a look. This is the most relevant provision for our purposes. Quote, the president, by using the militia or the armed forces or both, or by any other means, shall take such measures as he considers necessary to suppress in a state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy if it, then let's skip down to the second provision here, opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States or impedes the course of justice under those laws. So let's roll through each of those items. Is this an insurrection in Minneapolis? I think you could argue it's an insurrection, but that's certainly a debatable point. So let's put it aside because you don't need it, as we'll see in just a second here. Is this domestic violence? Of course it's domestic violence. What other kind of violence is it? It's not foreign violence. It's not international violence. This is violence being carried out by our own people here on our own shores. Are these unlawful combinations that ICE is dealing with? Yes, of course they are. Combinations is undefined. Could be thousands of people. Could be a dozen people. Could be 3 people. And is it unlawful? Yes, of course it is. They're obstructing ICE vehicles. They're impeding ICE operations. They're throwing things at ICE. In some cases, they're attacking ICE with snow shovels and fighting with ICE agents. So these are unlawful combinations. Is it a conspiracy? Yeah, I think you could argue it's a conspiracy. This is at least semi-organized activity. But if you want to consider that one debatable too, fine, let's put that off the table. You've already met the standard with the domestic violence and the unlawful combinations. And are these people obstructing the enforcement of our laws? Yes, that's the entire point, to obstruct and oppose the federal enforcement of federal immigration laws in the city of Minneapolis. Are they impeding the course of justice? Well, they're not attacking courts yet or trying to set up their own system of courts yet, but they are impeding the course of justice in the sense that they don't want illegal aliens put into lawful immigration proceedings, or they don't want the final decision of those proceedings to apply to illegal aliens if they have a final order of removal. So all this means that it's there in black and white. Trump has the authority to go to the Insurrection Act in Minneapolis if he wants to do it. Now, should he want to do it? Well, I would argue as a prudential matter, he should try other things. First, can we use more federal law enforcement to protect the federal law enforcement agents that are there now? Worth trying. If that doesn't work, you can go to the National Guard. And if that doesn't work, then you can go to the Insurrection Act. But obviously, going to the Insurrection Act is going to be a very big deal. It's going to cause a lot of controversy, and you want to try other things first. But conditions there are intolerable, and it should be incumbent on the progressive leadership of the state and of the city to be more responsible. If Jacob Fry does not want the president to invoke the Insurrection Act, he shouldn't be saying things like this.
Imagine if that city or that town was suddenly invaded by thousands of federal agents that do not share the values that you hold dear.
Or this.
We cannot be at a place right now in America where we have 2 governmental entities that are literally fighting one another.
To the extent Minnesota officials sound like they're Confederates complaining about, say, the 20th Maine Voluntary Infantry Regiment showing up within the city limits of Richmond, Virginia circa 1863, they are not helping their cause in terms of pushing back against the insurrection Act, even more fundamentally, they should stop with the BS about legal observers and say people are just watching ICE and holding it accountable and protecting their neighbors. No, they should tell the mobs to get off the streets and go home. Or in the case of Jacob Frey, perhaps say, get the F off the streets. That would make a difference. That would lower the temperature. But that's so far what the likes of Waltz and Frey are not willing to do. And that's why at some point, Donald Trump really might invoke the Insurrection Act fully within his legal rights. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.